Thank you, Angela. And Rushanara, please.
Thank you, Chair. And good afternoon, Dr. Carney. Good to have you back on the committee, albeit under a different remit. And we all hope that you can help save the planet. And in that note, and to pick up on, continue the theme of cheating, I just wanted to draw your attention to a recent report by a coalition of NGOs that stated that the world's biggest 60 banks have provided $3.8 trillion of financing for fossil fuel companies since the Paris Climate Deal in 2015. And despite everything you've done and others are doing, it seems that the argument that these banks have, and some of them have made it here on this committee when I've raised it, Barclays being one of them, is that there's a sort of transition that takes time and it'll all be fine in the end. By God, we hope it will. But there's a long way to go from what you've said already. So what else needs to be done to get companies to focus on that objective, and are you confident that all the measures that are in place, both in terms of what central banks are doing together as well as what governments are doing, including ours, is going to be sufficient to make that transition as fast as possible to stop this fueling of fossil fuel, financing around the world?
Well, I would say the following, which is that a number of the initiatives now are in place and are just being started to execute, be executed, and that will reveal the scale of the gap and the potential scale of stranded assets related to fossil fuels, which is something that has been hitherto high-level conceptual, and you know this well, but for those who don't follow as closely, it's more than 3/4 of coal proven reserves, up to around half of natural gas, and up to half, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of proven oil reserves cannot be harvested, burned, and us to stay within our carbon budget. I mean, that is the issue, and the extent to which there is financing against any of those assets. This goes to kind of it goes to the heart of the risk that some financial institutions are facing, and the process of climate stress testing, the process of having net zero strategies, and particularly for the banks, which is the heart of your question, banks that are in the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, within 18 months, they need to produce their decarbonization strategy by sector. Now they choose the sector, but obviously energy is one of the sectors. So it moves from I don't want to be unfair to any institution, but it moves from a talking point or a concept, don't worry, we have to finance the transition, to this is what we think the transition looks like in the energy sector. And this is the time path of the investments that the investments and loans that we're going to be making. That, of course, is cross-referenced against scenarios such as the NGFS, which has a 1.5-degree scenario, the IEA, which has produced a 1.5-degree scenario, which has very strict limits on new financing for fossil fuels in order to be, as you know, to be consistent with 1.5 degrees. So I think the crunch is coming, if you will, in terms of because of the element of transparency and the fact that there are stranded assets in some scale out there, and it will be increasingly apparent which ones are being financed by whom.
Okay, thank you. And just a quick question on the COP26 private finance priorities paper, and you've already touched on some of the points around the priorities around risk management, returns and mobilization. Which of the 4 priorities, reporting as well, you touched, which of those 4 priorities in terms of action that needs to be taken are the sort of toughest, and what else needs to be done?
Yeah, I think the reporting and the risk I would view as foundational. We can't get anywhere without reporting, without the information. and the risk management discipline has to be embedded in the institutions, and that's not to undersell them, but they're foundational. I would say that both the return side and the mobilization are now critical. It's what you build on that foundation. Where I think we are very much encouraged is that there has been this move at the core of the financial system, as evidenced by GFANZ's Glasgow Alliance, to having net zero plans. And what we look to do is to make those as rigorous and transparent as possible so that we can see where the financing needs to go. That said, creating these missing markets, and particularly so the carbon offset market, which is important as a complement to absolute emission reduction, just to be clear, it's a complement. It's something that stretches a very limited carbon budget for a period of time so we can get the real investment going on absolute reduction. I think as we sit here today, virtually the biggest challenge, I'm working up to it, is mobilizing capital in scale to the developing world. Given the scale of investment that's needed, and given that that's the least, well, it's the most challenging type of investment to make. Sorry, I'll hand back.
Yeah, I have got some questions on that about developing. But before I go on to that, do you think are you seeing enough international leadership on this agenda now? You said we've left it. You said earlier we've left it exceptionally late, and it requires a global effort. And we've also seen recently, Gordon Brown was referring to the IMF report about what we would gain if we invested, for instance, in vaccines across the world, and yet wealthier countries are falling well short of doing enough to get vaccines across the globe, even though we're in the midst of a crisis. And we can see, and we've been warned, that the climate crisis is even greater. And indeed, countries like Bangladesh, where I have a strong connection with that country, I was born there, where it's likely to face by 2050, 30 million climate refugees. Many other countries like that already seeing millions who have been forced into refuge. Is there enough leadership? And if there is, why is it that the $100 billion that was promised during the Paris summit hasn't been, that climate aid, annual climate aid, hasn't been met by 2020? And what are you doing to make that happen?
Yeah. So let me start with the 100 billion and then build out. The first thing is that the 100 billion is absolutely a top priority of the UK presidency in partnership with Italy. And I know that the Prime Minister personally, and certainly the COP President designate, Alex Sharma, have, they do, at least from my understanding and what I've seen, they do not miss an opportunity to raise this issue with those who are responsible. And it was a big push for the G7, and Canada and Germany stepped up. The UK has already stepped up. The US still needs to. There are others who need to make bigger commitments in order to bridge the gap. So it is acceptable.
Expecting to bridge the gap, we missed it. And how much have we missed it by? My understanding is that it's 78 billion has been committed. Is that right? That's I believe the OECD. This is an area for which I'm not directly responsible, to be clear, but it's the OECD numbers for 2018 are 78.9 billion or something. So there's a 21 billion gap, and it is a top objective of the UK to close that gap for Glasgow. Making that happen, and should we expect it to reach, albeit later, the 100 billion by November at the Glasgow summit?
Well, it's one of the criteria for success of the Glasgow summit. So every effort is being made in order to.
So you know who is responsible for making that happen? I mean, we've got a government that's cut the aid budget. UK government. You mentioned the Prime Minister emphasising these points in the G7 summit. He slashed the aid budget. Countries like Bangladesh you can't do climate change and climate finance and resilience without providing while cutting the aid budget. And yet, no disrespect to you, because you've shown great leadership on this agenda, even when you were the governor of the Bank of England. It's not clear who's going to take this forward and make this happen.
Well, the UK government has, I mean, you're more familiar with exactly what's happened in terms of the aid budget and the overall priorities. In terms of this specific issue, though, the UK has increased its commitment, and don't quote me on the decimal point, but it's 10.6 or 10.8 billion of commitment, which is consistent with, in fact, I think it's slightly more than consistent with the UK's share of that 100 billion. Now, can I make a bigger point, if I may, because it goes to where there's the intersection of the private and public sector, which is that the 100 billion absolute priority, and that's the government's responsibility. We need to radically scale up blended finance above and beyond this, because the orders of magnitude of the type of private capital that is being catalyzed by the multilateral development banks, and even to some extent the development finance institution, it's just too small. That's the bottom line. It's too small. And the units of account, I would suggest, are in the orders of 100 billion per annum. It happens to be the same number, but it's a different number. And we need to be putting in place a pathway to those types of numbers that are catalyzed. To be clear, I'm talking about private finance that's catalyzed. Now, one of the things that we're going to do, and I'll hand back on this, or we're in the process of doing, is lining up the private sector in terms of their potential commitments, provided there are the vehicles to blend with public finance for broad investment in developing world.
Thank you so much. My time's running out. I just have one final point to make and query, a question, I suppose, which is, given the pandemic, given the failure of international leadership, frankly, we're beginning to see that shifting and changing and improving on the pandemic, and also the pressures that the pandemic has posed. Do you think that the developed countries to mobilize finance to achieve net zero has diminished in relation to developing countries? You've spoken quite a bit about developing countries and mobilizing finance. But given the governments haven't even managed to reach their target of 100 billion, why should we believe that we are going to achieve the mobilization of private finance, especially given all the other pressures? Or am I being too pessimistic? Should I be more optimistic? Will you come back to this committee and tell us that you've changed that in the Glasgow summit? Should we be more hopeful in what you can achieve and what our government can achieve?
I'd answer that question this way, which is that the UK and other major economies are substantial shareholders in multilateral development banks. Those development banks are not yet Paris aligned. We have the curious situation where the private financial sector is becoming Paris aligned at a much faster speed than the multilateral development banks, including one of the things the multilateral development banks are not doing as a group is investing in adaptation. You rightly gave the example of Bangladesh and climate refugees. That's adaptation finance. That's part of what they need to do. And as shareholders, our expectation should be for material scaling up of the types of facilities that will crowd in private finance on the type of scale I was discussing. And that's one of the big.
Do you think our Prime Minister understands the benefits of multilateral institutions like the World Bank, given the way that the aid budget's been slashed this year? Does he actually get it?
The question for the Prime Minister, but I know that the Prime Minister at the G7 summit had a push on in his term, a clean and green approach to aid financing for these countries, and President Biden had a different terminology for it, Build Back Better World. I think whatever it's called, quote Ian Hislop, we can call it a banana. It needs to be translated into action on the ground. and of the pathways to. It's not going to happen overnight, but it needs to be a pathway to those orders of magnitude if we're going to address both the mitigation and the adaptation challenges the world faces.
Thank you. Well, I just hope that your influence will be, we very much hope is going to be a positive one on our government, because in the light of what's recently happened, it leaves us feeling pretty concerned of the mixed messages that are being sent. Thank you very much for your work.